Let's welcome Angel Beyde, who will be our fabulous facilitator tonight. She's the Equity and Outreach Director of the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario. She's also a master gardener, an educator, and advocate for social and food justice. And amongst all those things, she's also a brilliant and fabulous and very inspiring woman that I feel very lucky to have connected with. And I feel very happy that she's going to be guiding tonight's conversation. And she's gonna go ahead and introduce our speakers and guide us through this wonderful evening. So thank you so much, and welcome, Angel.
Great, thank you for the super generous and kind introduction, Ali. I really appreciate it. Warm greetings to everyone. It's exciting and inspiring to see the breadth of locations that people are dialing in from. I feel very warmed in my heart in these difficult times to see so many people showing up for learning about regenerating relationships. Very important theme right now. I am grateful to be situated in this beautiful land you see behind me. That's my little tiny farm, 8 acres. I'm basically on the border between Ontario and Quebec. It's a very beautiful little corner of the world. And it is the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Kanien'kehá:ka or Mohawk people, and the Wendake and Yanwetio. And this is Crawford Purchase territory. So yeah, I would really like to turn the floor over immediately to Michael and Phil to share a little bit about their backgrounds, and then we're going to have a pretty exciting conversation, I think, based on our little sneak preview last week, which was very inspiring for me. So yeah, I'd like Mike, if you want to take it away and introduce yourself.
Sure, thank you. So my name is Michael Bomford. I teach sustainable agriculture at Kwantlen Polytechnic University. And so I work with my students on a farm, on a piece of land called the Garden City Lands, which is in Metro Vancouver, the area called Richmond. And it's now, so I'm sitting right at the junction of the lands of the Musqueam people. They would have been west and north of where I am, the Kwantlen people to the east of where I am, and the Tsawwassen people to the south of here. And all of these people would have included the land where I'm farming in their traditional and ancestral territories. I'm eager to tell you about the place because I think that shapes me and shapes the things that I'm thinking about. And so I'll ask though, should I pause here and let you introduce Philip before I start delving into all of the farm and the Garden City lands?
I think maybe dive in.
Okay.
And then Phil is going to dive in, and then we're going to have our conversation.
Terrific. Okay. Well, very good. So the Garden City lands are right at the junction of an ancient peatland. And I'm sitting on an island at the mouth of the Fraser River. It's a relatively recently formed land. It was formed by the river washing deposits down after the river broke through after the last ice age. So 5,000 years ago, I would have been right at waterfront property. This land didn't exist 10,000 years ago, and it was just starting to form 5,000 years ago. So if we listen to the oral history of the Musqueam people, they talk about a time when this was all ocean, and the land emerged out of the ocean. So it's a really interesting place in that the people have been here longer than the land itself. Because the land was formed by the river washing silt and material down, it's all right at sea level. And so it's wet, or it used to be wet, almost all of the time. When settlers showed up here around the 1870s, they wanted to dike it and drain it, and so that's what they did. They built dikes all around this island at the mouth of the Fraser, pumped water out and dried it out. And in doing so, they well, kind of destroyed an abundant food system that existed prior to their arrival. So the Musqueam people and the Kwantlen people, the Sawasan people, were all using this land to harvest, well, berries and medicinals, but also ulacan and salmon and seal and octopus. A lot of the abundance of this land, well, came from the ocean, came from that interface between the ocean and the land. And the land where I'm living now was full of rivulets and gullies, many of them big enough to navigate by canoe. So people would have moved through this space through about 100 kilometers of navigable waterways. And that was also really, really valuable salmon spawning habitat and spawning habitat for all sorts of different fish that contributed to this abundant food system in the area. So when all of this was diked and drained, we destroyed that food system and a whole way of life that went along with these wetlands, and turned it into dry land in order to farm it. And this has been very productive farmland, and now largely urban land. Now, I'm right in Metro Vancouver, right on the south edge of Metro Vancouver. This is some of the most valuable land in the country. It's all built up on the west side of the island, but on the east side of the island, the land was placed into an agricultural land reserve back in 1973, so about 50 years ago. And that reserve has done a remarkable job of protecting the land from development, so it continues to be farmed. Much of that reserve covered an area of ancient peatland. So this is land where, in that wet, anaerobic environment, sphagnum mosses grew for millennia, built up on top of one another, pulling carbon from the atmosphere. And then the remarkable thing about sphagnum, this moss, is that when it dies, it doesn't rot. It stays there and then grows up on top of itself for succeeding generations. That represents then this tremendous store of carbon on the eastern portion of this island. And it was difficult to develop, difficult to build on. People saw some potential to farm it, but there's real danger in farming that land that we end up actually destroying the peat, and all of that carbon that's been sequestered over millennia can easily be released back up into the atmosphere. So this is the context in which I find myself. I have more to talk about, but I'm sort of recognizing that I'm dominating here and I'm kind of monologuing. So I want to pause for a minute and let you jump in, Angel.
Wonderful. I just love it. And I think someone is annotating with green pencil on the slide. So it's like, this is very enthusiastic. I love it. Maybe, we could. Yeah.
I wonder with the annotations, those aren't mine. I don't know who's drawing on the slide, but I think that somebody has circled an airplane. And I think that the airplane is important here because we're right on the flight path to the Vancouver International Airport. We hear the planes going over all the time. I have to pause when I'm trying to tell something to my students because these planes are so noisy. So, I recognize that there are lots of people listening in from all over the country, many of whom won't be familiar with the Garden City lands that I'm describing. But if you've flown through the Vancouver International Airport, you've flown right over this land. The last thing you see as you look down before you land is this piece of land, and we're right here.
Amazing. I like that extra nuance of place. Phil, would you like to jump in and just give people a little sense of background? I still see the annotation for some reason, but I'm not sure how to remove it.
Absolutely. And hang on, I'm getting the translations in my audio. There we go. Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Phil Loring. I'm with the Nature Conservancy, actually the Nature Conservancy Worldwide, not the Nature Conservancy of Canada. That's a different organization. I'm excited to be here and be in conversation with all of you. My background is academic primarily, though I grew up on the East Coast in Maine, and spent a lot of time on the water, spent a lot of time thinking about food. And so my professional career has been about food and food systems and how we make them more sustainable, ethical, and just. And it's taken me on a bit of a tour, whirlwind tour over the years, trying to find stories, trying to capture stories where people, through their food systems, through their food production practices and other traditions and cultures around food, we're creating win-win scenarios, right? Because we have spent so long talking about and assuming that everything we do, and we largely, I should think it's important to say, from my perspective, is a settler perspective, that's harmful. We're taught as sort of Westerners, when we think about our relationship with the natural world, that our footprint is a negative thing, as opposed to something through which we can care for each other and care with the natural world. And so I've really been thrilled over the years to be in conversation with people from around the world, from Alaska to Western Europe, to talk about how people are caring for the land. And you can take me to the next slide, because I just have a couple of examples that I can share to ground this a little bit. So my perspective coming into this conversation and in general, as I think about how we improve, how we collectively and at multiple scales, communities working on improving community food systems, people in universities trying to innovate and think about how to make more sustainable and climate-friendly food systems, people working on small farms, medium farms, large farms, anybody who's really meaningfully interested in having a conversation about changing the way we produce our food, or people working out in the oceans, bringing people nutritious seafood. And that's the predicament that all of us are sort of captured within, not necessarily because of our own actions and agency, is that the vast majority of food that is consumed in the world is produced through systems that I think we can fairly describe as degenerative. We take a variety of strategies that are, whether it's with chemicals or energy inputs or technologies, to coerce ecosystems to provide very specific things to us over and over and over again. And because that's not the way that natural systems work, that means the longer we do that, the more harm we do underneath, the more invisible harms often that we don't see as soil depletes, or the more invisible harms to people and their bodies and their societies and cultures halfway around the world that we don't see because it's halfway around the world where fish are coming from. And I have been really encouraged over the last 15 years of my career to meet person after person and see everybody talking about how do we do something about this? How do we transform our food systems? Who can we learn from? Who has, what communities and cultures have been not making these mistakes, developing food systems in ways that are healthful, ways that they can care for the land. And next slide. And just a couple of examples of that to sort of ground us in this conversation. One, I saw in the chat, lots of people have called in from the West Coast. And this is a picture of a small island in the Georgia Strait off of Vancouver, Russell Island. And this is a clam garden. This is an indigenous clam garden that I was invited to a number of times as a part of my research to learn about how communities were caring for this space, revitalizing traditional practices, and achieving outcomes where people win, culture wins, local heritage wins, and also biodiversity wins through the various ecological benefits, so to speak, of building this wall. This is a clam garden, so you build this wall and it changes, and you manage this wall and it changes the profile of the beach and creates a lot more clam habitat than would be there otherwise. It's a win-win. It's probably a win-win-win. It's healthy for the land. It embodies a long-standing relationship between people and a place. And the times that I've been there, I've just been sort of overcome with this feeling of care and this feeling of reciprocity between people and place. And the next slide. And then halfway around the world, I also had the invitations to go join, and this is where my family is originally from. This is Ireland. This is where my ancestors came to North America from here. And it's another example of people who have been a part of a culture on this land for thousands of years, restoring and trying to bring back traditional practices that had been gone, had been sort of abandoned for a long time for a lot of reasons, in part because of British colonialism, in part because of the modernization of agriculture. And this is a traditional practice of herding cattle called winterage, excuse me. And so in this part of Ireland, and the west coast of Ireland, which is very rocky, it used to be thousands of years ago that people would move the cattle up into the higher areas during the winter to have them graze there. And that practice was abandoned over time, but the lack of the animals on that landscape resulted in a lot of encroachment of really scrubby brush and a loss of species richness. Pollinators stopped going there, birds and other animals stopped going there. And in the last 25, 30 years, people have been revitalizing, small farmers who raise cattle have been revitalizing this traditional practice and bringing some animals back onto this landscape. And the impacts have been transformative. Species are coming back, pollinators are coming back, flowers are coming back. Again, this is when I got to visit, I went for the festival that happens when the farmers bring their animals out into the higher areas of the Burren, and everybody from the community goes and walks with them, and there's music being played, and people from out of town come for the festival to walk these animals out. And again, I was overcome experiencing this again with a very similar feeling of reciprocity and care and connection that I think is rare for a lot of people, but not rare for others. And so that sort of, maybe we can just stop with those two slides as a little bit of what I'm bringing to this conversation. I should say that I'm speaking to you all from what's known as Dish with One Spoon territory in Southern Ontario. I'm in Guelph, and that's also an apt metaphor, I think, for what we're talking about today, this idea that we all live in an environment that we are all responsible for, that we all benefit from, that we all need in order to survive and live fulsome lives. So we better take care of it together. And so why don't we move into some conversation with that?
Yeah, wonderful. I really love the connections between, Michael, what you're talking about, and Phil as well. I just see so many beautiful resonances. Some of the words that really struck me were degenerative, coercion, and flexible, as well as the draining of these lands and killing them effectively, and then also the reverse of bringing people and animals and life back to the land. And that kind of brings me to the first question. When I was doing a little research on both of your work, and really nerding out with much appreciation and enthusiasm on what you've been doing, the word that jumped out for me for both of your careers is energy. And that was a really strong theme of energy moving through our food worlds and our food ways. There was a great post recently from Rowan White, the incredible seed and knowledge keeper, who talked about not loving the word system and it being a very mechanized word. So I think that's a nice energy to bring to our discussion of energy and food ways. So, Michael, your work looking at energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, renewable energy production techniques for small farms, the very localized ways that energy moves through our food, through our food production. And then Phil, on the bigger scale, I really loved the work that you're doing on the conservation of change principle based on the law of entropy. So the tendency of energy to move from more useful to less useful form. So as it degenerates, and then it gets cycled or regenerated through living systems like compost, for example, to become more usable again. And I'm a big compost nerd, so I was very excited reading about this and about energy moving through a system. And if you don't have coercion, flexibility, it can transform and become alive again. And so I was wondering if you could speak to how, if we expand our circles of care, our relationships, or another way, our interconnectedness, which you both have been speaking about, if we nourish that, how could this empower ordinary folks to regenerate the cycles of energy in their own food communities? Because I know that's a question deep in the hearts of a lot of people joining today, is how can we do this? How can we make that energy cycle through our communities? How can we expand our circles of care in ways that can overcome divisiveness and degeneration? And so that it's not seen as yet another regime of inflexibility or coercion, but that's inviting people to this expanded circle of care and letting that energy kind of course through. So a lot of different words there, but I think I see some eyes sparkling. So
Yeah.
anybody can jump in the pool.
I'm happy to start. I had a lot of thoughts while you were bringing us into conversation, Angel. Thanks for that. And you know, maybe an entry point for me is to have the discussion about what our foods, what we want our food systems, the practices and life ways by which we produce and share and consume food, what they're for, what we think they're for. And because right now they're for corn all year, they're for watermelon all year, right? They're for strawberries all year, they're for frozen this and frozen that all year. And but what could they be for? They could be for care, taking care of each other, taking care of the land. They could be for joy and tradition and enrichment and health, right? And when you take that latter perspective, I think we open ourselves up to a lot of flexibility rather than expecting certain things all the time. What we're looking for is nourishment, which can come in lots of different forms, and joy, which does come in lots of different forms, and diversity is part and parcel to that. And so energy, you know, I always try to keep it from being a really reductive lens when I think about food, because our food systems are so diverse and so culturally pluralistic and so beautiful, and it involves so much. And there are lots of different kinds of energy we can share with each other and the land. Calories, right? Protein, but also, again, care and love and feeling of mutually shared destiny, if you will. And so I think that, you know, we are now witnessing the unintended consequences that came from, you know, a very specific set of practices that were trying to hold everything stable and keep everything very uniform, a very sort of industrial understanding of building a system to produce food. And that's not how living systems work. It's not how caring systems work. Living systems give, they flex, and they're the people and the members of the system who are in a relationship with each other give and take. And so I'm still being sort of very abstract, but I do think there's a conversation to be had over the kinds of energies we give, and maybe changing how we think about energy from being a matter of, well, let's be as efficient as possible, right? Let's try to get the most out of the least amount we can put in, which, if you think about it, is a bit of it's another way of stating exploitation, right? Put in less to get more. And instead think about energy in a generative sense, where how can we put in and multiply and add and create mutual thriving? Michael?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about energy in terms of calories and you know, the actual physical energy that supplies our life systems, and recognize that entropy, which you mentioned, Angel, is essentially a one-way process, that we have to have energy inputs in order to continue to support life on this planet. And when you talk about the recycling or rejuvenating that occurs in living things or in compost piles, really that all happens because of this constant energy input that comes from the sun, right? This fact that we're orbiting this star, that there are these fusion reactions generating masses of energy, and that we are, just sitting near enough that that we have this constant input. And I think that life on this planet depends on the capacity to collect that solar energy and turn it into life, life forms, largely mediated by photosynthesis. So I want to just celebrate photosynthesis for a moment. I recognize that this is a means by which plants are able to collect solar energy and take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and assemble that carbon dioxide, those carbon atoms, into carbon chains that provide this incredible abundance and diversity of life forms. And that then anything that eats plants is essentially harvesting that solar energy that was collected by the plants. And so that's one thing to appreciate. And then in terms of thinking about the abundance of energy, well, let's appreciate that we have so much solar power hitting this planet that it's been able to maintain these life forms and these living systems now for hundreds of millions of years. So that's worth considering. It's also worth acknowledging that photosynthesis is, well, a really inefficient process. That when we harvest a kernel of wheat or an ear of corn or something like that, that the energy that is usable by us for food is maybe a fraction of a percent of the energy that corn plant intercepted or that the wheat plant intercepted. And so we have this abundance filtered through an inefficient process. And I hear what you're saying, Philip, about the danger of using efficiency as a as the sole way of understanding things. But I want us to recognize the value in what's happening, and not to think that we can easily replicate that. So where's all of this going? When I talk about the peat at where I farm, or the peatlands of Canada, which are this incredible store of carbon, it's really also an incredible store of energy, isn't it? Because those sphagnum mosses have been collecting solar energy for thousands of years, using that energy to generate these carbon chains, and then storing that carbon underground. Now, peat is a wonderful substance. It's a very interesting substance because in a natural environment, it has there's actually not a lot of microbial activity. There's not a lot of life below ground in a peat bog because it's an anaerobic environment. So it's an environment without oxygen. It's a very acidic environment. So it's not an environment that favors bacterial abundance or fungi. And it's that lack of life that allows this peat to persist, and that carbon to be stored over the long term. Because in most soils, in most environments, the carbon would be pulled out of the atmosphere by the plants, and then the plants would rot come wintertime. So that doesn't happen in a peat bog. Peat is a proto-fossil fuel. If it's under in a compact environment, often with heat, it will turn into coal over the long term. And people can and have collected peat and harvested peat in order to burn it, to warm their houses. And they've also, obviously we burn coal, and we're recognizing, hopefully, that by burning these ancient stores of carbon, we're rapidly releasing carbon into the atmosphere and contributing to the planetary change that we're experiencing right now. Now, these peatlands are a way that the Earth has collected energy, stored energy. And this is essentially a gift that's been given to us. We have more peat in Canada than any other country in the world. We have this land has been storing and sequestering carbon for thousands of years, and vast pools of carbon stored across this country. And I guess I'm really wanting people to recognize and value the importance of those peatlands, and to recognize and value the importance of conserving them. And the challenge then is, what happens when agriculture starts to interact with those ecosystems? So that's kind of where I'll leave it now. I'm sorry, I said I would leave it, but I also want to think about the energy in food systems, and I'll appreciate the danger too in that systems word. But it was shocking to me years ago to learn that the fossil energy that goes into maintaining our food systems is far greater than the energy in terms of calories that we derive from eating the food that we're able to grow. To me, that's evidence of an unsustainable system. That's the definition of an unsustainable system. And because I'm interested in greenhouse gas emissions, of course, burning all of those fossil fuels is contributing to carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. But there's all of these other greenhouse gas emissions associated with agriculture at the same time. So it's not just the carbon emissions from burning fossil fuels, it's the carbon emissions that come from changing the way that we use our land. When we convert peatlands to agricultural lands, or convert grasslands to cultivated land, or log forests in order to grow food, that's carbon emissions. That's ancient energy that's been sequestered and now being emitted as carbon dioxide as that energy is released. When we and then the way that we manage our manure piles, the way that we manage our livestock contributes to methane emissions. The way that we use our fertilizers, particularly if there's an excess of nitrogen fertilizer, we're contributing to nitrous oxide emissions. So agriculture has this this double whammy of the emissions associated with our fossil fuel use, but then the even greater emissions associated with the actual act of farming. And this is and some of this is energy related. So I'll just leave that maybe a little bit of a downer, and let Angel and Phil jump in and respond or think about that.
Thank you very much. I love that we really went from the macro to the micro, underground, like into the ancient past. This is wonderful. The next question that came to mind as I was reading up on your work, it kind of resonated with the idea of how a lot of emphasis is often placed on eaters, consumers, doing less harm with their food choices. A very kind of restricting kind of mindset. And it could be framed as, eating organic, avoiding certain foods, like perhaps meat or dairy, or, eating only imported health foods. There's lots of different ways that can be framed, different kinds of conversations. And these kind of prescriptions can sometimes clash or create divisions in terms of cultural practices or ancestral food ways, not to mention budgetary constraints sometimes come into play. And it can create a lot of personal and community conflict, trying to do less harm. And so, Phil, I was wondering, in terms of your work, how might an invitation to do more good, that was something that came up in our conversation last week, this idea of doing more good, could that help folks deepen our connection to land and place and culture through the food that we eat and share?
I think so. I really like that phrase. I think moving into this new mindset of doing more good really is sort of at the heart of what I think is novel and perhaps radical about the way that people are now starting to use the word regeneration in respect to food and other kinds of design. Michael said something earlier that I think is related to this. He talked about, photosynthesis as being inefficient, right? That there's, when we eat those plants, we get such a small fraction of the whole thing. And through the lens of doing more good, the way I think about that is that, well, that may be, but all of that's not for us. That's for the rest of the plant, or that's for other aspects of the world or the ecosystem, the living system around us, right? And so when you think about it only as for us, it's inefficient. But when you think about it as a generative network of relationships, maybe it's not anymore. And so this idea of doing more good sort of, I think, asks us to be in a posture where we say, there's a lot of going on around me that's not for me. What am I putting into this world that's not for me, but for the rest as well? And that's the generative change to the generative mindset, which is if you put more in, there can be more collectively, in addition to more just for you. And so even just from the perspective, one way to think about this that I think is interesting is the concept of resilience, where being flexible, we talked about flexibility earlier, being flexible, allowing the cycles of release and renewal to happen at multiple timescales, from the soil to forest succession, working with those instead of trying to hold them constant and keep the landscape doing the same thing over and over and over again. That requires us to be flexible. It requires us to be resilient. And if we're relying on a particular crop from a particular part of the world or a particular fishery, and there's some reason we can't, if we're flexible and willing, we can give our resilience back to that land and say, recover fishery, recover soil. We do the things that aren't for us, and so we give that resilience. And then in the time of crisis or directional change like climate change, what are those opportunities where we can give our resilience to the other parts of the world that need it, whether it's another family net down the street or whether it's a piece of land that is and species on it that are aching to restore themselves and come back to life. That's what the first thing that comes to mind. But I do think that there's a really meaningful, and I don't want to overlook it, transition that we're seeing in the way people talk, with sustainability being this idea of doing less harm, as you said, and then the more we, and shrinking our footprint because our footprints are bad. Instead, starting to say, how can we grow our footprints in a way that's generative? So do more good for parts of the world that are not for us.
And it's incredible how, like, when you're speaking, like, I feel like my shoulders going down, my jaw relaxing, like it's just such a generous invitation, right? Like, I'm like, yeah, I can share my resilience, like from feeling quite beleaguered and stricken by the state of things these days. Just those phrases, I feel like a very visceral response of like, yes, like I have resilience to. I'm like, oh, this plant, like I can share with my house plant, like I can give care to this. It just makes me feel more generous. And I think that is really key. We had some great questions on the registration forums where folks were asking, like, how can I help, and how can someone regenerate their local community without causing division? And I feel like the secret key is in that inefficiency that Michael's talking about, and Phil, you're amplifying on, of generosity. There is a baked in abundance, all this sun going, all over the place and not necessarily onto my spoon is because it's feeding lots of other life. It makes me think about how when a plant makes sugar, makes carbohydrates, I think something like 60 or 70% of the sugar it makes is for trade and for relationship building. Right, in order to like communicate with the mycorrhizal fungi, being like, hey, I need some phosphorus. Here's some sugar. So the majority of the sugar it makes, if I'm not mistaken, is for relationship building and for expansion and for doing more good, an enlightened self-interest, if you will.
Yeah, and you can see the adaptations to the need to have those trade relationships and the difference between plants that we've bred to put all of their sugar into the part that we eat with a very shallow root depth versus perennial plants and even native annuals that will develop a much deeper and more extensive root structure because they rely on everything around them. Yeah,
they rely on community. So they can be more deeply rooted. Goosebumps. I'm verklempt. Um, Beautiful. So the next question that came to me was kind of, it's actually, it's almost like this was all planned. It actually is riffing off this idea of this abundance, this strength, this generosity, this resilience, so often in the language of conservation, and of, the natural environment. It's framed in terms of, understandably, of the crisis, right? It's something, nature's something that needs protecting. It's fragile, it's passive, it's dwindling. It's these peat bogs that we're destroying. And I was wondering, like, well, in terms of your work, what opportunities might open up for us? And as you as an educator, if we frame the work we're doing as working with nature, because we're part of nature, a collaboration-oriented mindset that works from this abundance, this excess of energy mindset, and how might that shift to that regenerative mindset? How do you see that relating to the work you're doing with the bog at the Garden City Lands? And so basically, how can conservation in this broader, more generous mindset support agriculture or vice versa?
Yeah, no, I certainly agree that we are a part of nature, that that we in farming need to figure out how to work with nature. And when I think about the way that the bog was managed by Indigenous people, and the relationship between the Indigenous people and the bog, I see much more of a collaborative kind of approach, sort of a relationship, as opposed to an attempt to dominate or to turn it into something else. So, but I do think that the kind of the settler approach was to try to create something entirely different, to try to change the natural ecosystem. And in fact, I think we succeeded in changing it quite dramatically. And the bog, well, so our farm is sitting right at the very edge of what was the Greater Lulu Island Bog. It was a huge expanse of peatlands. When settlers came, they diked the land, and then they started building roads north-south between the branches of the river. And they did this by hiring crews to dig ditches and pile the material from the ditches into the center that became the road. And they built a road that they called number 1 road that was a mile inland. And then they built number 2 road, 2 miles inland, number 3 and number 4. And that was all working. But when they got to number 4 road, they hit the bog. And the bog kind of fought back. The ditches collapsed, and they couldn't figure out how to build a road through that bogland. So instead, they layered planks over top of the bog, and for years it served as kind of a roadway that was essentially a boardwalk without really disturbing the bog. But over time, people did figure out how to drain the bog, and they built their roads, and they started farming on these drained lands. It wasn't easy. The dike, or the bog kept on lighting on fire, because once it was drained and there was all this carbon here, it was a tremendous fire hazard. And so there's this history of fires and smoke all over this island. But people eventually realized that they could modify these peatlands. They could turn them into what's called muck soil. They could lime it to correct the acidity, drain it to correct the waterlogged soil there, and fertilize it, because peat is not naturally fertile. But once you fertilize it, it does a great job of holding onto water, and it does a great job of holding onto nutrients. And by doing this, they could create this soil that was great for all sorts of different types of vegetable production. But in doing that, they also destroyed it. So essentially, by modifying this environment dramatically, you end up releasing the ancient sequestered carbon back up into the atmosphere. Now, the Agricultural Land Reserve, which was established here 50 years ago, recognized this tremendous capacity of the land. If it was modified, if it was turned into a muck soil, then it could be used for farming. And that's why that land was stuck in the reserve. We had the opportunity to farm there, but recognize that there's no way we can demonstrate any sort of sustainable agriculture farming on peatland. It's by farming it, we would essentially destroy it. And I should say that there are examples of people who are farming on peatlands. It's called polyculture, and the idea is you keep the land as wet as possible. There's a very limited range of crops that you can grow in that environment. Things like reeds and rushes, some of which could be used for construction material. Certainly, some of the berries are blueberries, cranberries, cloudberries. These are things that grow in a very acidic environment, and these are things that Indigenous people would have been harvesting. And there's capacity to build an agricultural system around some of these native crops. We went out and sampled this site and found that it was contaminated, that there were heavy metals all through it, lead and copper and arsenic and all sorts of, cadmium. And it turned out that these metals likely came from a firing range that existed at the site between about 1905 and 1925. So back in the early part of the 20th century, people were taking a streetcar up from Vancouver and heading out to this land to fire artillery and rifles across the property and contaminated it. So we couldn't farm there even if we wanted to, because heavy metal was all above agricultural thresholds at that site. This is a long story. The city hired a consultant to ask, well, what can we do? This land is in the Agricultural Land Reserve. How can we, is there any way to do agriculture here? And the consultant said, well, you can either layer soil over top of the peat, or you can haul that peat away. And they chose the second option, or the first option, to layer soil over top. They, as it turned out, the airport needed to lengthen one of their runways and had this mineral material that needed to be moved off site. And it all came to the Garden City lands. In the area where we're farming, they layered 70 centimeters of mineral soil over top of the peat in order to get us up and away from that contaminated land. Now, this seemed like a crazy thing to do. What busy beavers we are as humans in order to think that we could change this ecosystem so dramatically. But I started looking at research at ways that other places are dealing with peatlands without releasing all of that carbon. And I found that in Norway, people are actually flipping the peatlands. They're taking the peat that's up above clay and silt and flipping it over, putting the peat down below and the clay up above, and then farming that mineral soil on top, the clay on top. And by doing this, they're able to preserve the carbon that's in the peat, and you end up with a very low organic matter soil up above, and you can build up the organic matter in that soil. You can improve the low organic matter soil and essentially sequester more carbon. This is essentially what's been happening on the farming side of the Garden City lands. So we're working with a very, very modified environment. 2/3 of the land is still peatland. In fact, the area where we're farming had very, very little peat, but what is there, we've been able to hold in place, essentially. The sphagnum is never going to grow there again. On the 2/3 of the site where we're not actually farming is where the sphagnum, the bog restoration efforts are going on. And I'm inspired by success in restoring boglands in this region and getting that sphagnum growing again. And I'm seeing some of that happening at our site, but it's really slow going. It's learning how the ecosystem works, learning how it's been changed by management, and then trying to gradually shift our management in order to allow some of the natural cycles to resume and to continue. So that's happening on the conservation side, and I'm excited about what's going on there. The modified environment where we're actually farming, well, here we've established beetle banks all around the property in order to provide habitat for ground nesting beetles. We're bringing in organic matter in the form of compost, but then also cover cropping as heavily as we can in order to add as much organic matter to this site as possible. And we've dramatically changed this imported soil in a very short time. We have owl boxes and swallow boxes around, essentially perches for our raptors. So we're using the surrounding ecosystem is absolutely essential to the functioning of this farm. But the farm itself is a highly modified environment. It's not really a part of the original ecosystem. It's a constructed entity that exists only because of this odd history of contamination and destruction.
Thank you so much. That is really fascinating. And I would not have guessed that anecdote about flipping the clay and the peat profiles. But yeah, very busy bees indeed.
Very busy bees, yeah. No, it seems so counterintuitive, and yet it also, I'm kind of convinced that it's the best thing that could have happened at that site, given the particular history.
Mm-hmm. No, that's super interesting. Thank you. And I really like hearing about how the cycles are returning and the insects are returning, and the birds are returning. And it really is such a complex situation. I appreciate
really
the
is.
sensitivity and thoughtfulness that you're using to describe this. One of the things that came up for me just in terms of the perseverance in both of your careers and all of the energy you've brought to facing some of the most serious challenges of our age in terms of how will we continue, how will we feed ourselves, how will we continue to work together as communities. And that was also in the heart of many of the questions that we received with registration, with folks wondering how to do this work in elementary school classrooms. What do we see as the future of regenerative agriculture? And so the question that came to me is that in a time of, for many are experiencing collective grief and mass trauma, layered on top of our climate crisis, profound injustices happening. What's supporting you and giving your work energy these days with our uncertain future? What practices or strategies or relationships have been the most regenerative for you in your work? Phil, do you want to start?
Sure. Yes, I really do feel your comments about how much weight we do all this work under, all of us, everybody on this call, right? Anybody who is earnestly engaging with any initiative or passion to try to solve some problem, make the world a little better place for somebody, human or non-human. There's a lot of weight, and there's a lot of there are a lot of reasons, things that we see happening around us that we don't want to ignore, but that could make us feel as though just individual actions, the things that we have the ability to do and achieve on our own, will just simply be inadequate. And the thing that gives me hope is that that if I were to try to boil down one of the most critical issues challenges that's got us here, got us where we are, into the predicaments we face. It's disconnection. It's that there have been so many efforts to disconnect us from each other, disconnect us from the land, to isolate us as consumers, to suggest that the entirety of the problems we face is a matter of individual footprint and consumer action, reduce our ability to affect change, to our ability to vote with our dollar. When in reality, the solution is to rebuild those relationships. And you don't do those wholesale, you do them one at a time, and you build meaningful relationships, and it takes time, but it spreads, right? And it's like a sort of the story about a pond that's becoming covered with lily pads. And if every day the number of lily pads on the pond doubles, it's not until the 29th day that you realize it's half covered, and tomorrow it's going to be fully covered. That's how it happens when you build relations. It's like it only takes time until all of a sudden it doesn't, and then the world is dramatically transformed. I see that happening everywhere, in alliances of activism, alliances of food security and food sovereignty, in organizations like Regeneration Canada. When I started food systems research just under 20 years ago, these conversations were not as widespread. They were surely happening at organizations like Rodale, and they were surely people who were trying to make the change on their land. But there are so many relationships now and so much awareness, and all of us can engage in that, right? It doesn't have to solve every problem. It can just be a matter of getting to know somebody else in the food system, because right now our food systems separate ourselves from everybody else who's involved in the production of that food. You know, talking to the person behind the meat counter, or finding a way, if you have the means, to get a share box, or a CSA or a CS fish. If you have the means, finding the way to shorten the supply chain so you can be connected, reconnecting those relationships. There's lots of ways to do that. And sometimes they may seem inconsequential, but again, they're inconsequential until all of a sudden there's so many of them that they're not.
I love that. That also really speaks to, a question somebody had said, how can I regenerate in my local community? And it can be as simple as speaking to the person who makes your food, or who's selling you the food, or getting a community shared agriculture box. Like that's a beautiful way of rebuilding those connections. Thank you. Michael, do you have anything to add about what is giving you energy in your work in the face of a lot of darkness?
Yeah. Well, I have to agree that the relationships that we build are really, really important. I don't think, well, I know that we wouldn't have access to this land. We wouldn't be able to farm here if it weren't for the relationships, and the connections that we're building with our community are really important to us and to my students, and I think also to the community members who we're interacting and engaging with. I really I see great value in wherever we find ourselves, really becoming a part of that place and that community, of learning about the community and the place, and really engaging with it. Yes, that brings hope. Perversely, I find hope in the fact that there are horrible things going on right now. There's war, there's injustice. We have, as humanity, a horrible history of war and injustice. In many cases, it's been much worse. And the fact that that we have been able to survive, recover, that we have had that resilience in order to get through some pretty horrific history is in fact inspiring. And it's like, it's almost for the sake of our ancestors, we need to keep going. And I think so there are the relationships with one another here and now, and there's also that awareness of where we come from that I think is really important and potentially inspiring, even when it's depressing. It's good to know that these are not the worst of times, right? There are, in many ways, there are things that are improving.
Thank you for that. And I really like that call to ancestry, and I think that that's such an important part of relationship building as well, is looking to see where you came from, also for inspiration and for guidance and for connection as well. And I love the quote that we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. And for those of us who are coming from all different parts of the globe, sometimes our folks were brought willingly or unwillingly. But to know that, we have to keep walking, we have to keep going and fulfill those dreams that, when we were just a seed or a sparkle, to keep walking. And one question that comes to mind is when we're going to sort of just wrap up after this question so that we can allow for questions from the community we're gathered with today. One question that comes to mind often when I facilitate events like this is, who else would you like to see at this table? So we're all gathered around this virtual table today. As a call to action, who else belongs here? Whose voice needs to be heard as part of regenerating our relationships to the natural world, to each other, and the abundance that nourishes us? Who is missing from this table, and who would you like to see at future tables?
Yeah, of course, I don't know everybody who's listening right now, and I see a diversity of places and people represented, but I also, all I know is who's speaking, who's at the right at the table at the moment. I think that there's real value in connecting with and learning from Indigenous people who have worked in the various places that we find ourselves for thousands of years. They have learned a lot about how to relate to the land, and I think that that we do well to listen and learn from them. Here in Richmond, so I'm just south of Vancouver in the municipality of Richmond. And this is largely a community of recent immigrants, with a lot of people from mainland China, from Hong Kong, particularly. So and from Southeast Asia, and so I feel like we do well to learn from the people who we find ourselves in community with, and I don't necessarily see those people at the table all of the time. I think that we're all like kind of just learning to connect with one another and to live with one another. And I think in this particular area, even when we're right in the same spot, it can be too easy to kind of go our separate ways and live in separate bubbles. And so I think that we do well to build a broader community.
I really love that. And that's also reconnecting back to what Phil was talking about, how much our food ways have been invested in disconnecting us.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when you are disconnected, one of the things you do is consume.
Yeah.
Because you are sad and alone and feeling rootless. So we can see where that sort of spiral leads us. Phil, would you like to see at the table?
Well, the people that I think we need to find a way to help them to the table most are the people who have really important voice and aspire to food security, aspire to be able to have food on their table, aspire to live in healthy and just environments, but who are so overburdened by all of the obstacles in their way that they have a voice, but they can't bring it. They don't have the time, they don't have the resources, the money to participate, even if we asked. Right. And so figuring out how to not just elevate voices, but also compensate people for their participation when they couldn't otherwise, finding ways to connect creatively and bringing ambassadors for people who may not have the time or ability to bring their voice into the conversation. Because I think there's such a big piece of the picture aspirationally about what future food systems could look like, that you and I, the folks on this call, may not even be able to imagine, given the various privileges and experiences that we've had. But what more could we do? And we could only hear that from those voices as well.
I love that. That's beautiful. I think, you know, there's so many incredible calls to action that have come to this conversation. And I hope that, you know, as we wait for some folks, if they have questions, if people can feel that spark to just turn to the person next to them and, you know, spark up a conversation, you know, meet a local farmer, you know, grow some food and share it with a neighbor. You know, speak to the person who doesn't speak the same language as you. Like, you know, I definitely speak through plants a lot. I've worked a lot in urban agriculture. That was one of the questions about how to do this work in cities and towns and buildings. And, you know, that's how I got started with growing was, you know, first was with house plants and then balcony food and then urban agriculture plots and running programming. And it's incredible how quickly you can build a relationship with someone by handing them a little piece of something green, and, you know, eating together or growing a plant together and recognizing that even if you invite folks, sometimes there are barriers and obstacles like the systemic ones you mentioned, Phil. And so having that mindfulness too, that sometimes you're going to have to go a little step further. And, you know, if you're starting a group, find some funding to compensate people or to get babysitting money or speaker fees, you know, or have food available at an event so that people will come and they can nourish themselves. I also think, what's the point of anything that doesn't involve food? So if this were taking place on my farm, you would all be eating food right now, because this is the time when it's nice to have a little snack in the evening. Thank you so much. This has been such a generous and abundant conversation. I'm wondering if any folks, if you have questions for Phil and Mike, please feel free. I do see that there's been a few things coming through the chat. I'm seeing a lot of enthusiasm.
As we're waiting for questions, I just want to second the value of sharing food and eating together. I think that that's such a great way to build community. And yeah, I think that, I don't know, what is it, the old saying that the way to the heart is through the stomach or something like that? It's I think there's real truth in that.
I don't know if any of the regeneration team has questions.
And in case people are, you know, one question I might anticipate, because I hear it a lot while people are thinking of their questions, is I almost always am asked, what can I do? Right? These are really great ideas, but what can I do? And it sort of insinuated that a little bit earlier when I talked about building a relationship, connecting with somebody who you haven't been connected with. But more tangible, you know, than that, for those of us who have the means, choosing to participate in the alternative is just, it's radical activism. And right, all of the innovative things that people are trying to change our food systems have to right now exist in the shadow of a much bigger food system that has all the advantages. And so anything you can do. And sometimes what that can mean is not necessarily spending more money on something. If you can spend more money on local food, please do. You know, but sometimes that just means being flexible. You know, I think we mentioned briefly in our conversation the idea of, is there a regenerative cuisine? Is there a way to build into our habits for eating some flexibility and accommodation to the natural world around us and say, no, I don't need these things in the winter, or if I'm going to eat them, I'm going to can them. Right? I'm going to jar them, I'm going to put them in my pantry. I'm going to eat those things when they're off season or not at all. You know, seasons are a hallmark of the energy systems of this planet. They are, you know, part and parcel to cycles that's from small to large scales. And if we fight seasons, we're fighting natural systems, right? And so any kind of flexibility we can do like that, I think, is a meaningful contribution. It's gifting of our resilience, and it's activism.
I love that. And it's a beautiful invitation as the wheel of the year is turning into winter. And so many people have the tendency to grumble, you know, about the dwindling light or the cold temperatures or the rain. And in fact, this is part of the planet's beautiful movement, you know, and it's part of how it repairs itself and cycles energy in different parts of the planet. And so accommodating and being as flexible as nature is flexible is one way of advocating for and meshing with resilience in our foodways. I love that.
This is the time of year when the sphagnum really grows. This
Oh,
is all through the
cool.
summer. All through the summer, it just dries out and sits there and tries to survive the heat of the summer. And now that the rains have come back, it's turning green again. It's really it's so abundant and prolific, and it's just exciting to watch it at this time of year. Of course, you know, I keep talking about how this was once a big wetland and we've drained it, but now the winter time in this area is when the rains return. And you can really see the sphagnum respond, and this is just yeah, this is so important. I really want to echo the importance of seasonality and the danger of trying to fight the seasons. You know, this is one of the things that I am concerned about is, you know, we have a lot of local greenhouse production, and these greenhouses tend to be heated with natural gas. There are a lot of fossil fuel emissions associated with providing these tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers out of season. This is, you know, a time when even if something is local, it's not necessarily without its harm, without its footprint, and we probably need to think about what, you know, how we can produce food in a way that meshes with the local availability of resources and timing, and certainly preserving food and storing food through the winter is a good way to avoid the need for heated greenhouses. We've got our solar heated dome greenhouse, so we're using passive solar to extend the season as much as possible. It doesn't mean that we can grow tomatoes through the winter time, but it does mean that we can get our transplant started early in January or February, just using the heat from sunlight.
Lovely. And we have a question and an answer in the chat. I guess not everybody can see it. Lorraine has a lovely comment that, you know, they live in an agricultural area and source most of food locally, and wanting to know how to help farmers or producers connect with consumers. You know, most people still buying solely from the grocery store, no thought to how sustainable the food is. Also, many local farmers doing regenerative things, but not on the Regen Canada map. So Lorraine wanting to be a mycorrhizal fungi to be able to connect. And I'm also a connector, so I really appreciate that. Oh, I just saw your beaming smile, Lorraine. So that resonated for you. So yeah, I really like Phil's answer to one person at a time. Find someone who doesn't know how, who sees it as prohibitive, hard to do. Once you help people see that these practices are easy to access, it spreads faster. And Sarah's also saying, recommend those farms to the farm map. That'd be wonderful. But it is really one person at a time when we see that sort of monolithic mountain of the challenge. And you've got a little plastic teaspoon to dig, you know. But it does actually make an impact to just connect that one relationship. In my area too, a lot of people buy the groceries from Giant Tiger. They are very sad groceries there, but they're very inexpensive. So, you know, I do have respect for people working on limited budget, and I try to, you know, suggest farms where I know sometimes they have seconds. So, you know, the fruit that's not as glamorous, or the veggies that are a little dinged, and, you know, get them conversing with a farmer who maybe would like to sell some baskets at a reduced price, and, you know, get one person, you know, getting a bit of their groceries, not a Giant Tiger. That's great. And we have a few more. So yeah, we have about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to just sort of go through the beautiful chat that's blowing up here.
Yeah, I think we have time to answer maybe about one more, Angel.
Yeah. Do you folks want to help me choose? Because I'm just seeing so many. These are amazing.
Yeah, well, I see some questions about reaching younger children.
Yes,
with
about
this.
children.
And I think I really appreciate that. And I mean, I think the question becomes how to make, you know, what are the best ways to make that accessible outside of your own home, and to what extent are nonprofits can nonprofits engage in that? Can schools engage in that? In the States, in the last 15 years, there was a real resurgence of school gardening, but that only happens with parent support. That only happens with people on school boards supporting it, right? And so to bring more of that to our kids, I do think that hyper local political contribution, school boards, civic politics, that makes a difference. That can make the difference in terms of whether or not a book is adopted that has an agricultural curriculum in it. And then I also think I would love to hear other suggestions for that too, because I don't think there's one right answer there. I think there's going to be 100 different ways we do it.
For myself, working like in urban agriculture and doing programming with very diverse communities, one of the ways I saw children really getting involved was for them to have that sense of ownership of some part of the food they eat, whether it's planting seeds or cooking, helping with the livestock. And I know that sometimes folks, who grow up in these amazing communities, long for the urban grass that's on the other side of the fence. And I was an urban child who really longed to get back to the country, and it took me 50 years to get here. But yeah, I found that in urban agriculture, especially, the children who were the fussiest and didn't want to eat any of the natural snacks, and are quite querulous and rambunctious and fidgety and upset and wanting cell phones, when they got their hands in the soil, and they planted peas and they came back the next week and they were sprouted, like they could barely wait for the plants to grow. They were just like chewing on them like little goats. And it was really inspiring to see children like calming down and engaging and feeling such pride in the food they had grown. So yeah, that's one thing I find is having that sense of stewardship or ownership or relationship to something that is not on their parents' term or not on an adult's terms, but something that is a direct relationship. I feel like that's a very restorative and inspiring way sometimes to get youth involved, to see what interests them. So yeah, I think there's still so much more conversation happening, which is very exciting. And I'm wondering, Regeneration Canada, if there's a way for folks to continue to engage around this, if there's even an email or something where people can send questions. Maybe there could be a little follow-up article about this conversation today. I found it was really delightful in a dark and challenging time. I feel very inspired. I just want to thank Michael and Phil for being so generous with your experiences and your learnings and your perspective. And yeah, the Generation team, I'm very grateful to have been invited to sit at this table today.
Likewise.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you so
thank you.
much. This has been really, really fun to participate in this conversation, and lots of good ideas.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much to Angel and Phil and Mike all for joining us, and of course everyone else that participated too, spending some time with us for our first webinar in this series, and for the great discussion we had tonight.